Hello, this is a quick breakdown for my Croconaw animation, part 2 of my Gen 2 Pokemon reimaginations. Like always, I'd start with some research and then do some sketching. Trying to figure out as many details as possible this early in the process will help you later when tackling the character in 3D. When I have a somewhat clear direction to go into, I'll start sculpting in Zbrush. I did a full pass of these scales on separate layers. I wanted to give myself the option to reduce these details in case it turned out to be too much, which it ultimately did. Luckily, I could now store these layers in a morph target, turn them off, and paint the scales back in on a new layer, using the morph brush. This time though, with varying intensity. After UV unwrapping, I sent my model to Substance Painter for texturing. I exported two versions of the model, one low poly and one high poly. The low poly is for animation later. The high poly will be used in Substance Painter for baking. During baking, the details from the high poly version are transferred onto the texture of the low poly model, which means tons of extra detail without any additional polygons. This process also generates a bunch of maps that can be used in the texturing process and help you to easily texture certain areas of your model, like adding some color just to the top of the scales, for example. Rigging is next. The face is mostly rigged with pose morphs and uses some espresso to automatically control stuff like the lids following the eyes. Croconaw is a bit of a chubby guy, so I wanted certain parts like the belly or chin to jiggle around when he's moving. This effect is easily achieved by applying a jiggle deformer to the geometry and restricting its influence by painting a vertex map on it. The tail and tongue are controlled by spline IK chains to make it easier to deform them into certain shapes. The legs and arms are just regular IK chains. Based on a rough cut, I'd start animating. First using step keyframes to get the timing down and then adding more and more details on top. The water simulation was done with X particles. For something like this, you track an emitter to the mouth, have it shoot out particles in one direction and then add a bunch of modifiers like gravity or turbulence, but most importantly a fluid modifier, which will have them behave more like fluid rather than individual particles. You then mesh these with the OpenVDB mesher generator, and after caching, the fluid should be ready to go. Insidium has some great tutorials on how to create stuff like this. There's also an awesome tutorial on how to create ivy using X particles, which is the exact same method I used to create the ivy on the fountain in this piece. The environment is not all that complex this time. The fountain started life as a simple low poly model, which I sculpted some details on top. The fence is just a very simple model wrapped around a spline to frame the fountain. The hedges are basic blocks with some deformation, which I then used with a cloner object to scatter a bunch of leaves on top of. I baked these out as alembics later for better viewport performance. I actually also did this for the water simulation and the character itself. The most complicated bit was probably the water surface. I wanted to achieve a more stylized look. I created a disk and applied a vertex map to it, which is driven by the geometry of the character intersecting it. This vertex map drives a shader which shows an accurate depiction of the objects interacting with the surface. I placed the camera just on top of the disk and exported a PNG sequence to After Effects, where I used this as a base for some stylized water animations. This I exported back to Cinema and combined it with my water shader there. Next, I simulated a water body in X particles to get some actual deforming water. I then applied my water shader to the simulation using my previously created camera sitting on the top in projection mapping mode. This projected the water detail on the water surface. A lot of work for an effect that's hardly noticeable in the end. But that's just how it is sometimes, I guess. The scene is set in the early evening. I decided to light it mainly from behind. I placed a huge area light just behind the hedges in the back and gave the hedges some translucency to have it shine through. I used some fill lights to brighten up the front of the character and tracked a small light to his face so I could get some nice reflections in his eye to make him look more alive. I rendered the scene with Redshift and did some final compositing in After Effects. And these were mostly color corrections. The hedges were too bright and had to be darkened at the bottom. Also, Croconaw could use a good deal more saturation. Luckily, this is very easy to do by using some cryptomats that can be exported with your Redshift render. For the final touch, I'd add some fake volumetric lighting, particles, stylized wind, motion blur, and grain. This is the result. Thank you for watching.